To implement the mediator pattern using the observer pattern, first we should go to our UI control class and remove the concept of the owner. Our UI control objects no longer need to maintain a direct reference to a dialog box. They're going to talk to a dialog box indirectly using the observer pattern. So whenever there is state changes, they're going to notify the dialog box. Okay, so let's delete this field and this constructor. Now we need to introduce the observer interface. So in this package, let's add a new interface called observer. In this interface, we need a single method called update. Now, back in our UI control, we need to maintain a list of observers. So let's declare a private field, list of observer. Now we have two observer interfaces. Here's one in the mediator package. Here's another one in the observer package. We're going to use the one in the mediator package. Okay, now let's import the list interface. We call this field observers and set it to a new array list. Now here we can declare a method for adding an observer. So public void attach that takes an observer. And here we call observers that add observer. Now we need another method, public void notify observers. In this case, we don't really need a method for unattaching observers, so let's not worry about it. Now in the notify method, we're going to iterate over our observers. And for each observer, we're going to call the update method. This is how we're going to notify our dialog box. And by the way, this should be an abstract class because it doesn't make sense to create a new instance of the UI control. This is an abstract concept. We should only work with its concrete implementations like button, text box, and so on. So now let's go to these concrete implementations and make the necessary changes. First, we go to the button class. We no longer need this constructor because our UI control doesn't know anything about the dialog box. So delete. Now, after we change the state of this object, we should notify the observers. So we say notify observers. Now, technically, it would be better to make this method protected because we don't want this method to be visible outside of a UI control class. It's purely used internally to notify the observers when the state changes. So let's go to the UI control and make this protected. Now let's make the same change to the listbox class. We remove the constructor. And over here, we call the notify observers method. And finally, let's go to the textbox class. We remove the constructor and call the notify observers method. So now our UI control classes are completely decoupled from the dialog box. In fact, we don't even need the dialog box class anymore because the whole purpose of this class was to provide this abstract method called changed. With this implementation, we're not going to have a single place where we're going to have a lot of if and else statements. So let's completely delete the dialog box class. Now we go to the articles dialog box. Here we have a compilation error because this class no longer exists. So let's remove this part. Now our UI controls don't need a reference to a dialog box. So let's remove this. Good. We also don't need the change method anymore. We're not going to have a central place for handling all the logic. Instead, we're going to create a constructor here. So let's add a default constructor, articles dialog box. In this constructor, we should tell each of these UI control objects that this dialog box is interested to know about their state changes. So we call articles list box that attach method. Here we should pass an object that implements the observer interface. Now in this case, we don't really need to create a separate class that implements this interface purely to use it internally inside this dialog box. So we can use a shortcut. We can use the new operator and create a new anonymous inner class like this. Take a look. So we're creating a new anonymous class that implements the observer interface. And in this class, we have this update method. This is simpler than creating a separate class in this project that is going to be used only in a single place, and then have that class implement the observer interface, okay? So that is why we use an anonymous inner class. So this is how we attach an observer to this list box. This update method gets called when the state of the list box changes. What should we do here? We should populate the text box and enable the save button, right? So we can simply call this method that we created earlier, article selected. Article selected. Now, there's a shorter way to write this code. In Java, we have this concept called a functional interface, and that is an interface with a single method. This observer interface that we have in this project is a functional interface. Functional interface, an interface with a single method. If you're working with a functional interface, instead of creating an anonymous inner class, we can use a lambda expression. A lambda expression is a shorthand for a function. So this observer interface declares a method with a return type of void that takes no parameters. We can represent that using a lambda expression like this. Empty parenthesis goes to a code block. These parentheses are exactly the parentheses we have here. If we had multiple parameters, we would list them here. This is what we call the lambda operator, and this separates the parameter list from the body of a function or a method. So with this syntax, we can simplify this code. Let me show you. I'm going to rewrite this using a lambda expression. So articles list box dot attach. Now, instead of using the new operator to create an anonymous inner class, I'm going to use a lambda expression that represents the update method of the observer interface. So we type empty parenthesis goes to code block. Then here we write the code inside the update method, right? That is easier, but we can simplify this even more. Because we have a single statement, we don't need curly braces. So we remove the semicolon as well as the braces and put this on the same line. Now, compare these two approaches. Which one is better? Obviously, the second solution is better. So let's clean this. Now, we can take this to the next level. What are we doing with this lambda expression? We're simply calling a method in this class. So we can reference that method directly. Let me show you how we can rewrite this code in a shorter way. So we call the attach method. Now we type this with double colon and then type article selected without parentheses. So we're not calling this method, we're simply adding a reference to it. So with this line of code, when the state of this list box changes, this method in our class is going to get called, okay? So let's simplify this. That's better. Now the last part. When the title of the text box changes, we want this method to be called. So we say, hey, title text box, you should attach this observer. Now we can represent this observer using a method reference. So this double colon title changed. That is better. So with this implementation, we don't have a single method like changed with a lot of decision-making statements. In the constructor of our dialog box, we're attaching what we call event handlers. So these methods handle the change event of our UI control objects. So I would prefer to rename this method to add event handler. So let's go to our UI control class. And we right-click on the method name, go to refactor, and then select rename. The shortcut for this is Shift and F6. So let's rename this to add event handler. And now we can also rename this observer interface to event handler. That is more consistent with our naming. So let's go to this interface and rename this to event handler. Okay. It is better to rename this method to handle. So we have an object that handles an event that is raised somewhere else. Now back in the UI control, we should also rename this field to event handlers. And finally, we should rename this method to notify event handlers. That is a cleaner name, and that is what you see in a lot of GUI frameworks. Chances are you have seen this before. You have built applications using event handlers, but you never knew how everything works under the hood. So this is how we can implement the mediator pattern using the observer pattern.